Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from on this big, beautiful planet of ours. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we strive to dig a lot deeper than, well, I almost called it the mainstream media. But, you know, when you say mainstream media, that sort of gives it a credibility because you're saying that, well, it is something that is mainstream. I think, actually, we could call it maybe the dishonest media, you know, when it comes, or the oligarchical media or something. But anyway, besides the point, let's get on with tonight's show. I would encourage people, if you're listening to this later on YouTube, to become a subscriber. And then if you missed one of the shows, then you can just go ahead and listen to it on YouTube. And also click on my website. And that's on the, I guess that would be the right-hand side of the video where it says click here for articles. Anyway, what I'd like to deal with at the moment is with the question, is Russia really our enemy? No, seriously, come on. Many of us listening, including myself, grew up during the time period, you know, the whole James Bond movies and all that kind of stuff, where the Russians were our competitors at best, our enemies at worst. Okay? You know, so if you went to the movies, you might see Rambo or something like that, or any other number of these types of movies. And the thing is that during, you know, communism was an expansionist ideology. Okay? The idea ever since 1917 was to either show Russia or the Soviet Union as this shining utopian example of putting the ideals of Marx and Engels into practice, add to that Lenin in Russia, and the other side was actually just trying to promote it around the world. And during the Cold War, after World War II, there was a strong competition to get alliances with various countries. And it was sort of like having Facebook friends. It was, but you'd make a stipulation. You had two people trying to get the most Facebook friends in a high school, but their condition was that if you friended one of them, you couldn't friend the other. And so you can only friend one of them. And so each of these two individuals were trying their very darndest to get people to friend them. And you know, to win this competition. And that's what the Cold War was all about, because after World War II and England and France could no longer really hold on to their colonies. The French tried in Algeria and Vietnam, and that didn't turn out so well for them. But the Portuguese and Angola, and well, we could go on and on and on. But you had a huge number of countries in Africa and other parts of the world suddenly becoming independent nations. And there was this real quest to make sure that, well, if you were the United States, you were going to get as many of those countries to side with you as possible. If you were the Soviet Union, you were going to get as many of those countries to side with you as possible. And if you had a situation, because the way boundaries were drawn in many of these countries, especially Africa, where you split tribes apart or you placed two tribes that really hated each other into the same country, so one of the tribes would get control, and then the rebels would call on either the Soviet Union or the United States and say, hey, you know, yay communism or yay democracy, and get funded. And so America wound up with some pretty nasty allies, you know, especially Latin America. Oh my gosh, if you read up on some of those guys, they were really cruel to their people. Death squads and mass graves. You look at Indonesia, oh wow, lots of people died there. And, you know, the Soviet Union wasn't much different. They got people on their side that were not very friendly to human rights, to be sure. But this competition existed, and because of the nuclear weapons, they never really came against each other, mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union, the rulers in the Kremlin, they were like, no, things can get bad here, there, or wherever, but we're only going to push a button at a last resort. And the same was true in the United States. So cooler heads prevailed in place, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. And so ultimately, you had this competition, and I can imagine that there's still a lot of people serving in the U.S. State Department and in the media and so forth. Well, it may sound like the media and the government are kind of in with each other. Well, maybe that's a Freudian slip. Anyway, the thing is that you have a lot of people still who are in top positions that are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who came of age during the Cold War era. And the thing is, communism, it fell in 1991 in Russia, thanks in some part to some of the wars in the Middle East. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but in 1979, the government of Afghanistan was secular, and it was leaning to communism, and it was pro-Soviet. And the thing was that there were disenchanted people that wanted to overthrow that government, but the government held on. And then Zbigniew Brzezinski went over, and you can look this up. Zbigniew Brzezinski speaks to Mujahideen. It's on YouTube. And the United States started a policy of helping the what would later be called the Mujahideen. Later that would evolve into like the Taliban and other organizations, although this makes it very simplistic when we're dealing with the ideological breakdowns here. But ultimately, what happened was there was lots of fights against the government. The government felt like it was losing ground in Afghanistan, so they called the Russians in, or the Soviets, to come and save them. And I know this sounds a lot like Vietnam, doesn't it? With the North and the South there. But what happened was exactly what Washington wanted. The Soviets drug themselves into a war that couldn't be won. And they lost tens of thousands of men, just like the United States did in Vietnam. And this kind of destroyed the invincible image of the Soviet Red Army. And many Eastern Europeans, especially since you had a pope from Poland and you had a labor union under Lech Walesa that were striving for getting Poland to be independent and free of being under the control of Moscow. And this gave them a certain sense of power. And so essentially there was sort of a domino effect, if you remember that phrase from the United States, being fearful that you would have, if one country fell to communism, then the one next to it would fall to communism, and then the one next to it would fall to communism. It happened to the Soviet Union, where they couldn't really hold on to Eastern Europe anymore. And so eventually this even led to the Communist Party collapsing in Russia. Gorbachev was out on vacation and suddenly finds out he's no longer the president of the country. Okay, so 1991, there's a lot of history. It's really fascinating history here. But let's just, try to fast forward to present day. 1991, communism falls. I remember this. And I was thinking, along with millions and millions of other Americans, now we can get the peace dividend. That's what they called it, the peace dividend. Now we're going to be able to divert some of this money that's being spent on the military And instead we can start putting it into rebuilding our roads and bridges and maybe even, some people were talking some of this money could have gone into development of alternative energy. Maybe the space program could be resuscitated. Maybe, there's all this dreaming of all these hundreds of billions of dollars that could then be used for peaceful purposes and advancing the economy of the United States. Okay? And what happened instead was a lot of corporations. I interviewed Helen Caldicott this weekend on this issue, and she noted that a lot of corporations saw this as a money-making venture when Eastern Europe was suddenly now away from the Warsaw Pact or the Soviets. Then there was this sense of, let's go in there and persuade them to go into NATO, and then we'll be able to sell them all kinds of military hardware. Got to remember, this was Soviet hardware that these guys had, and it's incompatible with NATO. So if you persuade a country to join NATO, they have to replace their much of their current military hardware with American hardware. And so the thing was that under Bush and Reagan, I'm talking about the elder Bush. I'm not talking about the guy you see pictures of hugging Michelle Obama and, trying to get in good with the Clintons and that sort of thing. But, of course, I've heard some rumors about the old guy too that, in regards to this election. But the thing is that they had kind of told the Soviet Union, the leadership of the Soviet Union, if you guys leave Germany, let Eastern Germany go free, and then they could join back with Western Germany. If you just take your troops out and start this, go home, bye-bye, you've been here since World War II, it's, time to go back to Moscow. They would not advance NATO in Eastern Europe. But then when Clinton got in, they did. They started going into Eastern Europe and signing these countries up, which you can kind of understand why they might feel nervous, when they're next to the Russians, even though Russia's no longer communist, especially since Russia was so desperately poor. And you might wind up with some leader coming in that might want to go back to the old ways, restore the economy and the military and go back after them. So many of these countries did join, and the Russians were sort of powerless to do anything about it. Well, the thing is, it really didn't create a major problem until Ukraine. And you had a situation, as Ms. Caldicott pointed out too, you had a situation in which Crimea, when there was the U.S. orchestrated, I can't think of any other way to put it but a coup, and the leader that had been elected was thrown out, and a new one was brought in that was in favor of the West. Then, and by that I mean the European Union, the United States. Then you had a situation in which Russia was getting worried that Ukraine could actually wind up siding with the West in some future war or economic alliance, maybe joining the EU, maybe joining NATO. They could not afford to let Crimea, which, was where their military base was on the Black Sea, they couldn't afford to let that go. So Putin went ahead and went in and declared Crimea was going to be part of the Soviet Union, part of the Russians again. Maybe the reason I started saying Soviet Union was because I was going to bring up the fact that the Soviets, when they controlled the whole area, they just kind of said, oh yeah, tell you what, Ukraine, you had a hard time. You can have Crimea. And they kind of gave it as a gift in the 50s. And the thing was that Crimea had always been part of Russia. The people held an election. The vast majority, over 90%, said, let's be Russia again. And they joined. The eastern part of Ukraine They asked if they could do the same thing, but Putin was a little hesitant to go that far. Now, everyone says, oh, Putin just wants to take over Ukraine. He had the chance right there. He could have challenged Ukraine before it got any of its military in place and taken that region. But he had kind of hoped that the rights of the pro-Russian majority in eastern Ukraine would be respected. And he kind of trusted the West. Well, he kind of learned the hard way that you don't do that. Just like China and Russia learned the hard way when there was a Security Council resolution, was it 1979, was passed to put a no-fly zone over Libya. And they said, oh, this is just to protect the people of Libya from Gaddafi and him bombing them or something like that. Well, in reality, what it was used for was going in and bombing the heck out of Libya and taking Gaddafi out. Since then, I guess the Russians and Chinese have learned their lesson. But the thing is that there's been this real strong competition. And I would really strongly encourage people to go and listen to the recent 17-minute posting from Anonymous. And it's called Anonymous / The Truth About World War III. It goes over this in really good detail. And points out, like the whole thing about destroying Libya, and going after Saddam Hussein and so forth was far more centered around economics, preserving the petrodollar status and so forth. If you don't know what the petrodollar is, oh my gosh, you don't understand U.S. politics in the Middle East. Okay? You gotta look it up. I mean, it was brilliant of Nixon to do this because it really, if you make sure you make a deal with the primary leader of the oil producing countries to make sure that oil is traded only in U.S. dollars, you increase the value of the dollar tremendously. Supply demand works for dollars too. Now, the thing is, we can establish pretty well that Libya, Syria, although it's not so much the dollar thing, it has some other economic considerations, and Iraq had something to do with economics. Now, the thing is that in all these cases, Russia had actually said, this is not a good idea. Russia said, don't overthrow the government of Iraq. This war is unnecessary. There are no weapons of mass destruction. Bush masterfully, hinted, never actually came right out and said there were. He just worded it in such a way that people felt that there were weapons of mass destruction. And he worded it in such a way that made it look like that Saddam had something to do with the Twin Towers, which Saddam had nothing to do with the Twin Towers, okay? Now, the thing is that the U.S. and Russia, have started looking like competitors again, with Putin up there saying, trying to act statesman-like and say, hey, let's give the weapons inspectors some more time. Let's do these other things. And, the State Department really doesn't like that. You can go to the Wolfowitz Doctrine that states, at least in its original form, that the U.S. cannot tolerate ever having a competitor like it did during the Cold War ever again. And so it has to challenge competitors before they, as my dad would say, get too big for their britches. Now, the thing is that when Russia did what it did with Ukraine and did the annexation and so forth in response to the actions of the West in Ukraine itself, in Kiev, and the government, that's when the U.S. was able to persuade countries to put sanctions on Russia. Now, what they did with these sanctions was they actually drove Russia and China closer together, because Russia had to find other ways to make money. And if Western Europe was going to place sanctions, then they needed to sell their oil and other resources somewhere else, and they needed to buy their produce and so forth from somewhere else. So this has solidified Russia and China's cooperation, and it has created a sense in Europe. This whole tension for the past 3 years has been that many Europeans are scared to death that Russia is going to come and take over, and that if you see someone with a Russian, language T-shirt on at the park, call up and, oh my gosh, there's a Russian spy here at the park. He's playing frisbee, I think, or something. Maybe it has something to do with checking out Air Force or whatever. But the thing is, it's really apparent that there is this buildup. There's this demonization of Russia, and it's not just the rhetoric you hear in politics. It's in the media. It's in, you get these articles that will try to associate Russia with every evil there is. And, usually that's how the U.S. acts before it's trying to set up the pretext for a war. You demonize, and then the people are willing to go, hey, these guys are so bad, we got to do something about it. And it's been used against Arabs. It's been used against now the Russians. It's been used against many other peoples, all the way back to the William Randolph Hearst and the whole thing was leading up to the Spanish-American War, over 100 years ago. Now, the thing is that if, in the election, the U.S. election between Trump and Clinton, my daughter was listening to the debate, and she was listening to the segment that had the part about where Trump is talking about having better cooperation with Russia and so forth. And then later there's this thing about hacking. And Hillary makes it sound as if the Russians have been hacking into everything, and maybe the whole thing about the exposed emails that have shown the corruption of the Democratic Party, that they allegedly went after Bernie Sanders and these kinds of things. It seemed that she laid that right there at the foot of Russia. And even said that Trump, when he made a joke about, hey, Russia, do you have any of those missing emails? And she's like, hey, Trump's encouraging espionage against the United States and this kind of stuff. And I guess it sounds pretty good in rhetoric if no one knows anything about it. But the thing is that she even went so far as to say that Trump has been, stated admiration for Putin. Now, I'm getting kind of worried about this because this goes along with some stuff that Julian Assange has pointed out that Hillary has been very quick to accuse people of working with the Russians. And that's dangerous. I think he called it maybe a new McCarthyism might be arising. And this is not good. When Hillary Clinton calls Vladimir Putin a new Hitler, okay, that was never done under any administration. Ronald Reagan didn't do it to Andropov or Brezhnev, and Bush didn't do it to Gorbachev. You got to recognize how much the Russians are still sensitive about Hitler, okay? They won the war. Yes, my dad was in World War II. He was fighting the Japanese. The thing was, though, that in the European theater, it was a bloodbath on the Eastern Front. Those jokes that if you ever watched the TV series Hogan's Heroes, whenever Schultz would do something stupid and his commander, what was his name, Klink? Wow, I've never even thought of this show for decades. Commander Klink would say, Schultz, do you want to go to the Eastern Front? And he's like, no. In the German military, you did not want to go to the Eastern Front because that was almost suicide. And the thing was that the Russians had, they lost 20 million people. 20 million. Every family in Russia lost someone in that war. And for someone like Hillary to then equate Putin to Hitler, that is really hitting low. That's really hitting low. And especially since Putin's from St. Petersburg. If you look at some of the, I mean, when St. Petersburg had a blockade against it by the Nazis, they lost like half their population to starvation. And really horrific conditions the people lived in. The ones that survived barely survived. I mean, you were lucky if you got yourself a rat and you could cook it up for some protein. And the thing is that do you really expect better relations with the Russians if Hillary's elected? I mean, right now I think she'd be smart if she would back off a little bit and maybe even start talking about maybe we should start trying to work with Putin. Maybe we should try to get some stuff done. Well, she could even say, okay, tell you what, we'll try to hold some negotiations and even say that, well, stop hacking us or something. By the way, there's no proof whatsoever. Zero, zilch proof offered by anyone of any credibility that the Russians are the ones who've been hacking in and releasing all this information. Okay? Zero. Zero, zero, zero. It's just something you could say. It's like, okay, they did it. And then the media perpetuates it. And sometimes very subtly, they'll use the words like, Russia allegedly may have. Oh, come on. In people's minds, that comes out to the Russians did it. Okay? That's how Bush sold the idea of the Iraq War, was using that kind of rhetoric. And so ultimately, we got a situation where we have to ask ourselves, is World War III really worth all of this? And, we talk about responsibility. Let's pretend this. You got a house. You got a neighbor. And the two neighbors really have had, some bad time. No, this would be even better. You got a house where both of the people that own the houses have died, and they've left it to their sons. And so the one son moves in, and he's kind of like, okay, well, I've heard that there's all this antagonism with the neighbor. Let's just see what happens. And then the other son moves in, and he wants to ramp up the antagonism. He's like, you know what? He wants to maintain this antagonism. So what he does is he starts putting booby traps along the fence. He starts putting weapons with strings attached to the triggers all along the fences. He sets up a situation in which the neighbor, every time he looks out, sees even more weapons aimed at his house in his living room than, every day. And the neighbor that's putting up all the knives and the guns and the arrows and all this kind of stuff at the fence is screaming out to all the other neighbors, look how this neighbor is dangerous. I need to protect myself from him, even though that neighbor's not doing anything. And the thing is that this leads to a situation in which Russia feels like it's on a super defensive, and this puts things on a hair trigger. Because if one of those weapons goes off, we are going to see a situation in which that neighbor's going to respond. The Russians will respond, except instead of knives and arrows and guns and stuff like that being fired, through the houses and the windows and stuff like that, you're going to have nuclear weapons. And there's a 3-minute launch situation. And as, Ms. Caldicott stated in her interview, the Russians have what they call the dead man's switch. And that is that if Moscow got blown up, okay, you take out the leadership and think, yay, we cut the head off and now they'll surrender. Everything's stopped. Well, the Russians, at least, they used to, they've never said they've gotten rid of it, had a computer system in the Urals, and its nickname is Dead Man Switch. And what it is if everything around, if suddenly it just starts detecting huge changes at various locations in temperature, radiation, and seismic activity, and there is no connection to the command leadership of the country, the nuclear weapons get launched. Now, I'm just going to say this. As Ms. Caldecott stated, a war with 100 nuclear bombs going off would devastate the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. Things would be very bad. There'd be mass starvation. Many of the higher organisms would die off. Okay? You would have a situation in which we would not be able to sustain ourselves. Much of the world's population would die off. Okay? Limited nuclear war. 100. She's talking about the idea that if Pakistan, India ever get into it and they launch and you have 100 nuclear bombs go off, that it would devastate our ecology and would probably, it'd probably wind up with hundreds of millions of people dying indirectly from the radiation and the dust in the atmosphere blocking out the sun. Now, think about this for a second. If America thinks it can knock out all of Russia's silos, how many nuclear bombs is that going to go off? Just to knock out the silos. Let's pretend America doesn't even get hit. Okay? You knock out all the nuclear bombs. And, of course, you're not going to get all of them. But that's going to have to be at least well over 100 nuclear bombs going off. And think about that. Are we willing? Shouldn't we be making friends with Russia? Shouldn't we be making some effort to get rid of this hostility? When you've got people like the former speechwriter for JFK who's come out and said, I'm voting for Trump. This is crazy. And then you got people, you got all these other people that used to work for the Reagan administration, this kind of thing. And they're saying, this is dangerous. And yet we have a situation now where I don't know what. Maybe we live in a video game society where everyone thinks, oh, yeah, we got 50 lives we can use in this video game. That's not the way it is. You set those nuclear bombs off, you're going to wish you lived in The Walking Dead because it'd be a much nicer place to live. Instead, you're going to have it with radiation, and things are going to be bad. So my strong encouragement and pleading would be, we need to make friends with Russia. Okay, we really do. We cannot afford for the superpowers that have all these nuclear weapons to be enemies, because ultimately the consequences are just too great. And so, whether this election or in other areas, people really need to consider this. This is actually the number one issue. I don't care about some of these other issues people are making a big deal about. Okay, I don't care about Trump maybe having a bankruptcy here or there, or something like that. And, whether Hillary's, on all kinds of, some looks like has more medical stuff than a Dalek on Doctor Who. Those are not the issues. Preventing nuclear war and having better relations with Russia is a much greater concern. This is the kind of stuff that you would think, whoa, this should be like front page. And it's not. Front page is like what? Americans aren't concerned with the possibility of nuclear war? Let me just say this. Nuclear war is not a video game. Okay? It's not The Walking Dead even with a little radiation involved. Okay? Much worse. I'd much rather live in the world of The Walking Dead than in a world after just a limited nuclear war, if anyone believes such a thing is possible. Because you know what? A limited nuclear war makes anything in The Walking Dead look like, a trip to Disneyland. And people have got to realize what nuclear war really would mean. If we wind up pushing too much, what happens if something you got a major incident take place, escalations build, and then war starts. Are Americans willing to sacrifice their major cities in order to make a point with Russia? Is Russia willing to sacrifice its major cities in order to make a point with the United States? Well, I mean, you could think that cool heads would prevail, but I'm not sure that they would. I'm really not sure of that. But let's just look at what nuclear war would be. Let's pretend we even had a limited nuclear war, okay, where maybe a little exchange takes place in Eastern Europe. You know, the idea that maybe for some strange reason, I have no clue as to why they would do it, Russia would try to take the Baltic states, you know, Latvia. I mean, I've been to Latvia. It's a beautiful country, but I really don't see any reason why Russia would want to risk a nuclear war taking it. Okay, the majority of people are not Russian there. Strategically, it's not that important really for Russia, unless you actually had a full-scale war taking place between NATO and Russia. Then it actually wouldn't be that hard for the Russians to go through Kaliningrad and slice off that whole section of, you know, the Baltic states and some chunks of Poland and so forth. The thing is that, let's say it winds up, you know, a limited exchange where just a few nuclear bombs go off, okay? Of just a few. So let's take a look at exactly what that would mean. I think people should actually look up what a limited nuclear war would be and see what the effects would be. Now, there was a lot of talk back in the 90s and so forth about, you know, what would happen if India and Pakistan went at it, because they don't really have that many nuclear weapons, but it would really cause a lot of damage. Now, let's just point something out here, okay? That's India and Pakistan. Just a few nukes go off. Now, let's say you hit a major city, okay? Just a regular Hiroshima-sized nuclear bomb. I read somewhere that New York City has 15 nuclear bombs pointed at it by Russia. Now, Los Angeles, I don't know. Probably Los Angeles has nukes targeted from Russia and China, you know. But let's just say you hit a city. Let's say Los Angeles, because you have that scene that maybe many people remember from Terminator 2. Yeah, Terminator 2, where the woman's looking over, she's having like a vision, and she's looking over the city while she's with her children on the child on the playground, and you know she gets vaporized when the flash hits. Now let's just think about this for a moment for all you video game people out there who like to play apocalyptic video games in which, you know, there's a nuclear war and you're fighting mutants and that sort of thing. Bomb goes off. You know, you got maybe a radius of about a mile. That's about 1.5 kilometers for those listening in Europe. You've got a radius of about a mile, and that would go out, and pretty much everything there would be vaporized. Have you ever seen those pictures when the bomb, I can't remember if it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki, where the bomb went off above ground? And so there was a major heat blast. Okay, you're playing around with the power of the sun, okay? You're playing around with fission. And there's shadows on walls where people were walking down the street, and the blast hit, it vaporized them, but their bodies were casting a shadow against walls in which there's an imprint. Now they disappeared, okay? Boom, gone. Okay, most of the people in the middle of that blast zone would be dead. Okay, gone. That's it. Then you go out another, couple miles or so, and those people, for the most part, most of them die. Okay, most of them die. Some would survive, maybe if they were in buildings that had a little bit of thick walls and so forth. But if they didn't, they'd have severe damage. They would not survive very long, unless, of course, they were in some sort of maybe government shelter or something like that. provided for the elite. But what would happen is they would pretty much be all dead. The ones that would survive would be, their eardrums would be perforated from the sound. Their skin would be pretty much gone. Okay, so they'd be peeled. They would be skinless, and they would very soon die of the shock of, basically, think about it. They're basically just what's left after you take the skin, fry the eyes out, and so forth. Speaking of eyes, if you look at a nuclear blast from a distance, then, if you're in the city and like you're the Sarah Connor looking over as the bomb goes off over Los Angeles, she would cease to be able to see. Okay, now that's a very interesting concept. Several miles out, if you actually saw the blast take place, your cornea would be melted. You would, and if you're a little bit further away, you would have a permanent damage to your eyes from looking at it. I mean, you think about people say, don't look at the eclipse of the sun because it can damage your eyes. This is much more powerful and brighter than the sun, okay? And so pretending as if the thermal wave, it's like a pyroclastic cloud. You ever see those? When a volcano goes off, it sends out a cloud at like 600 miles per hour, and if it hits you, you just melt, essentially. Yeah, you're burnt alive by these temperatures. The one that would come out from a nuclear bomb is much greater than that. And then you go out a little further, and then you're going to have just massive damage. Think about hurricanes. But, these hurricanes are actually nukes, the radiation and so forth. Now, the radiation will kill most of the people that, if you're talking about a city like Los Angeles, the middle section's gone. The ring around it for a couple miles is gone. Now you're starting to hit people surviving, let's say a couple miles, but many of them that are very much exposed to the brightness will, have massive burns. They're going to die eventually. When Hiroshima was hit, there were people in the river who'd gone to the river to try to cool off, and they basically were just fried. They were just, the river was strewn with bodies because the people would just die. And then you go a little bit further, then, you have most of the people surviving, but at the same time, what happens to your infrastructure? Now, I've just talked about one city. Let's just pretend it's just a few cities on both sides. Let's just pretend. New York, London, Berlin, maybe. Moscow, St. Petersburg, maybe. And of course, I'm not even talking about the military exchange that would be taking place, where pretty much your standing militaries would be targeted with tactical nukes and battlefield nukes, and basically they'd be gone too. So what do we have there? Aside from just the human toll, understanding that anyone you knew in the city is dead. In the outer areas, people understanding that they're dead. You're also going to have the radiation destroying electricity. Okay? Everything you've got that's electronic, bye-bye. It's gone. And so this EMP, there's a theory that, first of all, that the Russians have EMP devices that they would set off that would fry all the electrical grid. But there's also the theory that when you have these large-scale blasts take place, that the radiation would then destroy electronic equipment. So, you got a pacemaker, you're gone. Okay, bye-bye. If you've got all your stuff on computer's worthless. Might as well just, use it as a doorstop or something. So all of our infrastructure that depends upon electricity, it's gone. So when the lights go out, and that's going to be a major problem, because now how do you raise food? Okay, even I'll get to the food production in just a minute, but let's just pretend it's a limited war and, we still have most of our agriculture still in existence. Then you're going to wind up with a situation in which you're going to have people with no food and no hope. And that's when you're going to see, it's going to turn into like warlord situation. And the thing that's different from The Walking Dead is the fact that these are going to all be cognizant people. Now, many people will just be in shock and they'll just give up and die. Okay? They'll just say, forget it. I don't even want to live here. There'll be others who will be very, very prepared, and if they're not prepared, they're going to find a way to survive. So it's going to be pretty brutal. And, when you don't have a paycheck for the cops, they're going to be trying to save their families. Okay? Military, same way. You're going to have total disintegration of the government infrastructure. If you've got a neighbor that really doesn't like you and they're armed, no one's going to protect you anymore. Okay? You're gone if they choose to take the law into their hands, because there won't be any law. Now, I will say one thing. I read that there was a briefing that was given to Ronald Reagan back in the 80s in which the military experts show him what would happen in the event of a nuclear war. Now, this is a real credit to Ronald Reagan. Reagan became physically ill. That's right. He became physically ill. The trauma of thinking about what a nuclear war would be like just sickened him. And you notice, it was Reagan who tried to actually bring peace between Gorbachev's regime and the United States. Okay? Kennedy, after, the Cuban Missile Crisis, he really wanted to have a peaceful cooperation with the Soviet Union. And I'm not one of those people that, is in the whole conspiracy thing with Kennedy. But, it's interesting. But the thing is, he coincidentally, when he was setting up these programs that he wanted to go to really open things up with the Soviet Union, he kind of passed away real fast. But anyway, the leadership that we had, I think that would include, you had Reagan, you had Carter before, you had Nixon and Ford, Johnson even, Kennedy, Eisenhower. They all were statesmen. They all understood. Now, some people are probably going, what, Carter? Carter was sane, okay? You might not agree with him on everything, but he was sane. So was Johnson. So was, Nixon. But I'm not really quite sure about the state of our leadership that we're getting from the Republican and Democrat establishments today. Because this idea that the government is floating, that I've been reading more and more about, that, this plan of, hey, America could take a limited nuclear war and come out ahead. How will you win a nuclear war? Let me ask you that. Remember what I said? St. Petersburg, Moscow, they're gone. Okay, well, New York, London, Berlin, they're gone. What do? Say, okay, we won, haha, we declare victory. Okay, or do you invade the other country and threaten it? Well, you've already let the genie out of the bottle. Okay, you've already used nukes. Well, then the other side, whichever side starts losing territory is going to shoot off a nuclear weapon and destroy the army of the other side. Well, of course, that means the other side is going to be thinking, well, you just wiped out our whole military here. You wiped out, 20 divisions of NATO. Well, let's get rid of a few of your divisions in Russia. And then, there's no stop to it, okay? Once it starts, it's going to be like a bar-room fight with drug cartel people when the lights go out, and people are just firing away at each other. Okay, that's what it's going to be, and then you're going to see massive destruction. If that happens, what would happen then is you would get massive amounts of dust in the air. Very few people realize that there was a volcanic eruption that was just before the French Revolution that cut crop production in Europe. It was a volcano going off, okay? And, somewhere in the Pacific. And it caused the winter to be abnormally long in Europe. And crops died, and a lot of people were starving in France, which, of course, when people were starving, they're more likely to follow people that call for revolution. And, I always get a kick out of history books that don't ever talk about science, because history people tend to, you say something about science, and they're like, yeah, they stick a cross up and you're like, oh, be gone with thee, type thing. Although I shouldn't say that, because the irony is usually the science type people are more religious than the social science people. But anyway, the thing is, you don't see these kinds of things talked about that often. But, there was a scientific reason behind it. And the thing is, now think about all these nuclear bombs going off and sending radioactive dust into the air. First of all, you're going to block most of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere. You see, the northern and southern hemispheres, if the war was only in the northern hemisphere, it would affect the southern hemisphere, but it would not devastate South America, Australia, New Zealand, and those parts of Asia that are in the southern hemisphere, Africa. Now, infrastructures would be destroyed, and there would be mass die-offs, but the infrastructures of the northern hemisphere would be devastated. And the thing is that I've heard it would be like most of the sunlight would be blocked in the north. A lot of the sunlight would be blocked in the south, which means temperatures would cool. You've heard the term nuclear winter. Yeah, you haven't heard that since the 1980s. Yeah, we're now way closer to nuclear war now. The concept of nuclear winter would be that your temperatures would drastically decrease in the northern hemisphere. When those temperatures decrease, growing seasons would end. Okay? Livestock would die. Okay? I mean, what would you do? What would you got to feed them? What are you got to feed your cows, your pigs, your horses, and these kinds of animals? What would you feed them? There's no more grain. Okay? Because you can't grow the grain. You're going to have a little bit of time that you're going to have a lot of barbecues. But after that, you're going to run out of food. And so most of your livestock, most of your most of your large mammals would actually die off. You'd have an extinction that would be something similar to the theory the comet when it hit the Earth destroyed most of the dinosaurs, and then you would have that here. Now the thing is that that in the southern hemisphere, the growing seasons would be cut as well. It would be like having thick dust in the air, like when you go into a very polluted city, and so forth. But there would probably still be some life in those regions, although with population densities, what they are, in many of these countries, it would be a brutal existence because people would fight for whatever they could get. Again, Walking Dead, who you worry about more, the zombies or the people? It's the people, okay? They're way more dangerous. That's the way it would be like during after a nuclear war. Now, on top of this, you're going to see, my prediction, I've read a lot of stuff that has various predictions. Some people say all human life would die off. Others say no, well, the people that took precautions, preppers, government personnel that are underground in their fallout shelters, like that scene talking about in Dr. Strangelove. This would be a die-off that would probably be more than 90% of the human population. Just getting rid of the electrical grid alone in the United States, I've heard that would kill about 2/3 of the population. That's no nuclear war even, just the electrical grid going down in the United States. Within a year, you would see in a year, you would see approximately 70% of the population die off. Add into that the radiation sickness, cancer, and all of these other factors, and yes, humans would survive. But it'd be similar to that. Now, maybe many of you are not old enough to remember this, but remember there was a Star Trek episode, the original Star Trek, the good one. I don't care that much for the newer ones, but except for the movies. The movies lately have been kind of good. But anyway, in the original Star Trek, you have one in which they come to this planet, and it's actually, there's been a war between the communists and the people that supported democracy, but it took place thousands of years earlier. And they note that there's this one guy who's he's come down and he's made alliance with the communists, and because he thinks they have a secret of like these 1,000 or 2,000 year lifespans. And what it turns out, though, is he's wrong. They don't have any kind of secret mixture. It's just that it's noted that after this major nuclear war, only the very, 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 very fittest people survived. And so maybe after a nuclear war, you would wind up with a just the very strongest people or the cleverest surviving it. I would probably put more faith in the southern hemisphere surviving, though, than the northern hemisphere. Although there would be people that would survive. I think preppers and so forth would survive. But nevertheless, Western civilization as you know it, and the rest of whatever's in the northern hemispheres would perish. Okay? The Gulf states, they would perish. I mean, they import their food. They're out in the desert. Those people would die. Most people would die of starvation. And I would say it would take hundreds of years to restore anything close to what human civilization was like before a nuclear war. And if you did do it, many of the cities you think of today wouldn't exist. They'd just be abandoned, and nature would take its course with them, and they would just disappear. You might see cities like New York, just look like that scene for Planet of the Apes, where Charlton Heston and the girl he's got are on the horse, and he doesn't know yet that he's on Earth in the future. He thinks he's on another planet. And they come to that scene where the Statue of Liberty is just sticking, the top part and the torch is up in the air, but it's buried by coastal sand. And he's just going, you idiots, I saw a meme that said, you idiots, you voted for Hillary. But no, he's like, he's really upset because he realizes that Earth is gone.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UC.